Well, if you put it this way, if we'd gone back to 2020, March 2020, and they say we're going to put interest rates up from 1.5% to 4.5%, and you said prices were only going to fall by 10% in the next year, people would think you were optimistic. So actually, 30 does not sound, it's not crazy, put it that way, by any means.
Okay, so effectively, John, just for the record here, everybody, John is predicting a house price fall of significantly more than 30%.
Not significantly more than 30%. That's a hostage to fortune. But certainly, definitely 30% over the
That was Bloomberg senior reporter and author of the Money Distilled newsletter, John Stepek, in a Twitter space, one of our best ever performing Twitter spaces, something to do perhaps with the very eye-catching forecast or doom-laden forecast for a huge drop in the housing market. I'm David Merritt, and this is In the City, Bloomberg's podcast connecting you to the stories and the voices at the heart of the City of London. So, as promised, this week we are going to talk about the outlook for both housing and inflation in the UK. And to do that, we're joined by our senior reporter, Phil Aldrick, our UK eco expert, and senior reporter, John Stepek, author of the Money Distilled newsletter, and as you heard, the voice behind an epic prediction for the housing market. John, let's start with you. Still sticking with this 30% number? I think it sent chills through London and Britain to hear you say that their house prices might lose a third of their value.
Yeah, like I said, I was very careful to say in real terms, which is after inflation. Obviously, inflation's relatively high at the moment. But actually, if you look back in history, it's not that drastic a forecast. Assuming that a house price crash actually happens, the average, and again, real terms over the last 4 house price crashes or so, since the 1970s, has been for prices to fall by about 27-28%. So in the 70s, for example, house prices never fell in nominal terms. But because of the high rate of inflation during that period, you actually get a real terms fall of about 30% between 1973 and 1977. Whereas in the 2008 crash, for example, you had a 27% fall from peak to trough. Most of that was nominal terms because inflation obviously was absolutely tiny after the financial crisis. So in terms of the actual scale of the peak to trough fall, 30% is not actually outlandish. It's not an outlier. The question is obviously, why would that happen? And the very simple answer is it's because interest rates have gone up. People always talk about how physical supply will prop up the market, or there's a shortage of housing, etc., etc. But it's not the physical. You can complain about the physical supply of houses in this country. You can think that the planning system's too restrictive. There are all manner of reasons to reform the way we build houses and what we do with houses and how we sell houses, etc., etc. But the fundamental driver of the price, and the reason it's so unaffordable just now, is because interest rates have been on a secular downtrend for about 35, 40 years. So when interest rates go up, the amount you can borrow for a mortgage goes down, which means that basically the price of houses has to come down. It's almost an arithmetical, logical follow-on. And so obviously interest rates have gone up this year. They've started to tick down a little bit. I think it's very unlikely they'll go back to 0% because that was an aberration. Well, now I think in an era where inflation's going to be higher on a kind of long-term basis, and even if that just means that the average is about 3% over the next 10 years, that means interest rates are going to be higher again, and that means that house prices have to correct.
So you are sticking pretty firmly by this. In fact, it
Yes.
sounds like it might even be a sort of modest forecast.
Dave, you're trying to entice me to go even further. Yeah.
Go strong, John.
Absolutely. Phil, what's the implications for the economy as a whole of people losing a third of the value of their houses?
Well, that's the interesting thing, because the price is set by the marginal buyer, right? So just because somebody doesn't have as much money to spend on the house because they can't get as large a mortgage now that interest rates have gone up, means that they will bid less. And so then all these house prices, which are related to, if you're buying a 2-bed house and there's another 2-bed house nearby, it's going to have a new value because that's the new market value. And so if you're staying put, it doesn't really make an awful lot of difference. The factors which really are significant, obviously, are whether unemployment is going to be shooting up and people are selling into negative equity because they have to get rid of this enormous debt trap that they're stuck with, which is the mortgage. And so that's basically the most critical factor in terms of the economy. The other impact is obviously the wealth effect. If people don't feel that they've got this enormous amount of wealth, which they can release if they need to, then that just makes them spend a bit less. But before the financial crisis, people were releasing their equity. There's these equity release mortgages. People would take more and more money out of their house as the house's value went up, and then they would spend all this extra money. But that's really not been a sort of something that's happened since the financial crisis. So
because they haven't been able to, right? The banks aren't doing those schemes.
You can remortgage. You could remortgage every time you've paid off like 20% or whatever. 10%. You could then remortgage up again, and also if the value of the house has gone up and you have your earnings have increased, you could remortgage again. But it just hasn't been as much of a factor. So I don't think the economic impact of falling house prices will be as dramatic as has been seen in the past for that sort of slightly muted wealth effect, and also for the fact that really what will define whether the housing crisis transmorphs into an absolute economic crisis is if it's accompanied with this unemployment shock, which then causes massive sales. And the only part of the housing market where you can really see that happening a little bit is the buy-to-let end, where they're all on interest-only deals, so they're going to get really whacked by the increase in interest rates. That's going to be felt much harder than on the repayment side, and they're going to start. I mean, the Bank of England was saying this last week that they're going to start selling. They expect the buy-to-let guys to start selling, and that will put more pressure on those sort of marginal prices. So you can get closer to the apocalyptic forecast from John.
But, so if John's right about interest rates sticking around at that, even if, say, it's 3% or so for a while, there's this rolling impact, isn't there, from that, of people remortgaging or their deals, their very low rate deals coming to an end. I just did mine a couple of months ago. And it's a bit of a shock, right? Suddenly your payments are going up a lot. How are we seeing that effect? And that's only going to get worse, isn't it, throughout the year? People are going to have less money to spend in this economy for years to come, aren't they, because of what's happened to interest rates?
There will be, that people will have less, but in a way, having the fixed deal means that you can plan for it. You've got, it's coming down the line, and you can start planning for it. That will depress consumer spending, but it's not having as dramatic effect as these rate rises as would have had in the past. You've got the bank says over the next year we're going to have 4 million mortgages in total. Either they're on 1.3 are on standard variable rates, so they're just floating, and there's another 2.7 that are fixed rates that are going to be refixing. Then you also have actually about 5 million people in private rental who will probably get all of these interest rates passed directly onto them as their rents go up, as the landlord tries to recover his higher mortgage costs. So that's about 9 million households out of 28 million households who are going to feel directly affected by this. There's going to be some bloodbath. There's going to be some horrible experiences for some people. That is inescapable. But when you're looking from the economic point of view, you're looking at the aggregate picture here, and that isn't enough to make you terrified that there's going to be some kind of economic devastation through this channel. That's my take anyway.
I mean, rates going to peak anytime soon, John? I mean, what's your forecast for next year?
I mean, obviously the market thinks rates are going to peak, the Bank of England interest rate is going to peak at about 4.5% next year, and I can see that inflation probably has peaked. And I don't actually think inflation is going to be the big worry for next year. I think probably where the surprises will start coming in is that we get to 2024 and 2025 and it doesn't go back down to what we've seen in the past. I think that's one thing. But I mean, I agree with everything that Philip said. I don't think the housing market itself is as much of a problem for the wider economy as it was in, for example, 2008. We've had quite a lot of statistics pointing out that the people who have mortgages at the moment tend to be better off than the average, because affordability is so bad. I mean, a lot of people have just been squeezed out of there, and banks aren't as vulnerable to it either. And the other good thing is that wages are going up. They're only going up in nominal terms. Because inflation's so high, we're still kind of losing out in real terms. But I mean, the private sector average pay rise at the moment is over 6%, which is quite certainly chunky compared to the recent past. If that can continue while inflation comes down, then, you've got, cross your fingers, maybe you get a point where real wages actually start to go positive. And as long as unemployment doesn't pick up, then you could have a pretty shallow recession and not an awful outcome, again, in aggregate, and still have house prices coming down and actually affordability improving. And then maybe you take some of the tension out.
There's sort of the silver lining to this.
Yeah.
All those people who want to buy a house, right? Like, it's actually kind of, they're going to sit on their hands for a bit, right? And see, but a 30% drop in prices is going to mean a lot of more people can get on the housing ladder, right? I mean, it's going to be is that actually going to be a net positive for the economy as a whole?
It would be good politically.
Right.
I mean, I think something and overall, eventually it'd be a good thing. I mean, I think we've kind of perhaps lost sight of the fact that houses really should be affordable. It's like at the moment, I mean, according to the ONS, house price affordability relative to income, the average house now costs 9 times the average income, and that is the highest ever. The kind of long run average is closer to something like 3.5, 4.5, and that has ticked higher over the years. But 9 is ridiculous. And really, I don't think that, in an ideal world, we'd be living in a country where everyone could afford to buy a house or rent a house, and they weren't constantly worrying about the impact of the cost of simply having a roof over their heads on their standard of living. It's not great for productivity or intergenerational stability and all those things. So if we get a decent sized correction in the housing market, then you take some of the sense that young people have of, basically futility. Is certainly the sense I get from talking to some of them, even around here. And if you're working in the Bloomberg building, you're not going to be the most deprived young person in the world. So I think it would be a very positive thing to see some sort of relief on the house price front.
Yeah, because obviously the barrier has been deposits. You can't get the deposit you can get the debt, you can't get the deposit. So if the property price comes down 20%, you're more likely to be able to get the deposit. Plus, if your salary's gone up by 6.5% and you're earning 4% on what little savings you have or whatever, then it's all kind of moving in the right direction in terms of helping that intergenerational fairness, that equity, which is part of social division at the moment. So absolutely, it would be good in some ways.
We're supposedly in recession, right? This is what we're being told. And you said, John, maybe there's quite an optimistic view that perhaps we come out of this. It's a little bit shallower. The Bank of England have said some pretty bad things about the forecast. What sort of recession are we really going to be in for the rest of next year, and when are we going to come out of it, Phil?
The Bank of England's forecast was based on a projection for interest rates to get to something like 5.5%.
Feels like that's not going to happen, right?
It may, but there's everything is aligned. I mean, but politically and on monetary policy, there's no desire to go to that level of interest rate. At the moment, interest rates are at 3.5%. They may get to 4.5%. But even at 3%, the Bank of England was forecasting a shallow recession. But it had this weird number in its forecast, which was that households typically in a recession go into their savings because that's what your savings are there. They're your buffer. And in this forecast, the Bank of England has them increasing their savings. So they're saving more and more, which just, and the OBR had a very different take on that. They said that people will use their savings. And as a result, the forecast in the OBR's report was much shallower than the Bank of England's. And there's no individual macroeconomic instability. There isn't like massive debt overhang in the corporate sector. There isn't a massive debt overhang in the household sector compared with the financial crisis. The banking sector isn't about to collapse because it's running on paper-thin levels of capital. There hasn't been a splurge in business investment or commercial property building. You can't see something which is just going to cause the economy to just implode at the moment. So it's just the interest rate effect, and it's really that's what's bearing down on the growth prospects of the country by taking demand out of the economy. But I just don't see that as being anything other than this kind of brief, shallow recession.
So why is the Bank of England being so gloomy? What is it? What's wrong? What's wrong with the Bank of England?
It's a good question. Obviously there's been a lot of turmoil, and Am I allowed to say the word arse covering on this?
Yeah, I think that's
producer's thumbs up.
I think there is an element of that because, there was quite a lot of mudslinging between the politicians and the Bank of England during their
we discussed
September's
it on this
unpleasantness.
podcast over the summer, in fact, right? The bean counters.
Yes.
They had also the bank had a very weird prerogative in its forecast because at that point markets are saying rates are going to go to 5.5%, and it wanted to send a very clear signal to the markets that you're completely wrong, boys. You're just out of the park wrong. So we're going to, using your projections, we're going to show you that the scale of the recession that's causing is so nonsensical that we're never going to do that. So they were so this is their communication mechanism, which seems to be a little bit sort of obtuse to have to communicate in this way. But so the overstatement of the recession is effectively a way of saying it's, our rates are never going to go that high. That was the main point of the recession forecast, which is obviously at the same point telling everyone to prepare for a catastrophic recession is not particularly good signaling to the general public, but they're kind of thinking about
I guess thinking about what you just said, over the summer it's kind of feels like a lifetime ago perhaps, but they did have to step in to stop the sort of systemic collapse of the pensions industry. So the firefighting that happened over the road there from where we're sitting, it was real, right? And so maybe that explains some of the doom-laden thinking.
Tricky thing where they had to make that forecast kind of between statements as well, didn't they? They weren't really able to take account of what the fiscal statement may or may not say. So there's an element of there being a kind of warning shot across the government's bows there as well.
That's a good point because they've their latest their latest rate setting minutes say that about a third of their forecast recession has been removed by the fiscal stimulus in the autumn statement.
Right.
So it's better already.
It's already better.
They're already saying it's better. Yeah.
So what else could spoil the party next year, John, do you think? It sounds like if we're going to come out of recession sooner, inflation's already past the peak. Are you not worried about anything next year?
I think the main one's energy prices. Yeah. I think that's probably the biggest wild card. And that could go two ways, so energy prices could fall a lot faster than we expect, and that would be great, obviously. But equally, there's all manner of reasons that you could potentially have a spike in either oil prices or gas prices or both. And that would definitely make things much trickier. A lot does hinge on employment. If unemployment starts to go up, then I do think to an extent all bets are off. It could get really messy.
That's what's strange about it. So this recession is not an unemployment-led recession, is it, at the moment? We're still seeing the jobs market hold up, and we're seeing those pay increases as well that you mentioned. It's a bit of an odd feeling for a recession, isn't it? People are keeping their jobs.
Yeah, at the moment. At the moment, there's still over 1 million vacancies out there. So the thinking is that the companies are just going to stop planning to hire people, and so that's what where you can absorb some of the redundancies in the labour market, and also people, as they roll out of jobs, they'll basically just retire or leave the country or something. And so that's clearly what they're planning. Businesses are not currently planning huge redundancy rounds because they're finding it so hard to hire people that the last thing they want to do is get this, what used to be this incredibly easy asset to get hold of, which was a worker. It seems to be now incredibly hard to get hold of one. So you don't want to just ship them out for without very, very, very good reason to do that. But it's unemployment. The Bank of England's forecast for unemployment was that in its disastrous scenario was for a 500,000 increase in unemployment, which is
pretty mild compared to recessions of the past, right?
Precisely, yeah. It is relatively mild, and so that was even under its bleak scenario.
Yeah.
I suppose the only other thing is maybe and I don't really know how likely or unlikely this is, but some sort of sovereign debt crisis somewhere in the world.
Not in Britain.
Probably not in Britain.
We nearly had that, right?
We nearly had it, but we're actually not the most vulnerable from that point of view. Our debt to GDP is high, but it's not like insanely high. I guess if there was going to be something that would probably erupt in the Eurozone, because that's the bit where it's hardest for them to step in and fix it. But even then, the kind of ECB has kind of got a license to print money if it needs to in extremis that it didn't have in 2008. So I think maybe a sovereign debt issue, but even then, that's kind of an outside.
Yeah, so the UK is more reliant on the kindness of strangers than, to quote Carney's, basically foreign investors are buying our debt. And next year we're issuing an absolute glut of the stuff. And the Bank of England is selling off 80 billion, will be about 40 billion left, of the gilts it's holding. So basically the Bank of England and the Treasury are going head to head and trying to, compete for people to buy the gilts they're selling. That is a huge area of vulnerability in the UK.
Well, we tested the edges of that, didn't we, in the summer?
Exactly. So
with disastrous consequences.
So financial stability upset in core markets like government bonds, that genuinely could be one of those kind of complete left field shocks. Obviously Ukraine and Russia, that whole situation escalating. Some terrible geopolitical mess with China, all that kind of stuff could all but of the sort of more visible possibilities, the financial stability issues which come with issuing so much debt next year, that could be one of our Achilles heels.
And then politically, just to kind of maybe wrap up, where do we see this government headed next year? Are we going to make it through the whole of next year without having an election? I mean, can Sunak keep this Conservative administration together?
They're an unruly lot, aren't they? I don't know how you manage the Tories at the moment. It's he's had to scrap his planning reforms temporarily because
they're completely unbiddable, aren't they, at the moment? So how does he get any sort of agenda?
Exactly. I mean that. So if they can't get the business of government working, then it's hard to see how there can't be an election next year. But the Tories are incredibly apt at survival, and the idea that they're going to kind of self-sabotage themselves,
immolate, basically.
One thing to think about there is that if the election is called, not until very late 2024 potentially, and by that point, I mean, to your point about wages have risen, so the level of wages has gone up, and at that point you may see inflation just through the mechanism of energy prices falling, etc. May see inflation below zero temporarily or at around zero, and it would just be a temporary thing, and so you would have this this wedge opening up where people are definitely seeing pay rises larger than inflation. There could be a period of, if growth has recovered, we will have had 18 to 24 months to try and fix some of these immigration issues, sort out some of the Northern Ireland Partnership stuff, and which could then get a little bit of more economic momentum going. You can see that gap narrowing to get pretty tight if people are feeling at that point in time, their earnings are paying for more. They're not seeing real terms declines in living standards at that point,
and they can afford a house, right? Because it's going to be cheaper than it was, right? So it's a sunlit uplands. Down the line, right? I love it.
I don't know how we've ended up there, Dave.
It's like the opposite of the Bank of England around here, right? This is just we're going to talk the British economy up, right? Well, thank you so much to John Stepek and Phil Aldrick.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks for listening to this week's In the City. We'll be back next week. But in the meantime, if you like our show, please head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts and rate, review and subscribe. This episode was hosted by me, David Merritt. It was produced by Summer Sardi, editing and sound design by Blake Maples. Special thanks to John Stepek and Phil Aldrick. And be sure to check out John's newsletter, Money Distilled.